My name is Rosie. I'm going to be talking to you about chapters 1 and 2 of the novel. Chapter 1 is called The Exam, and right away we're with Henrietta, and she's at Johns Hopkins Hospital. She's there to see a gynecologist, and she's stating, I have a knot in my womb. But a year prior to this, she was already feeling symptoms of a bulbous growth in her abdomen, and she's talking to her girlfriends about it, and they're all kind of just waving off, saying, maybe you're just pregnant and you just don't know it yet, which ultimately she does become pregnant with her fifth child at the age of 29. But even after giving birth to the child, she's still feeling that original symptom of the growth in her abdomen, the discomfort, but now she's developed a new symptom of hematuria, which is blood in the urine. So from here, she decides to give herself a vaginal examination where she does feel a bump. And so she goes to see a local physician and he runs some testing on her. She's failed some of his testing, so she's misdiagnosed, but ultimately she does get referred off to see the gynecologist that she's seeing at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And there, upon examination right away, they were able to see a lump in her cervix and they cut it in half for a biopsy. Just to cut it in half must have meant that it was pretty sizable. So then the physician brings up two concerns. The first concern being, why was this not diagnosed in the hospital when she had given birth to her son? Or how did it just go unrecorded at all by anyone? So it brings up the concern that maybe that she was treated unfairly in this moment, or not giving the same care and treatment that she deserved. Or it brings up an even scarier, at least I think it's a little bit scarier, thought that it must have been a lot smaller then and probably missable. And now it has grown significantly since the birth of her son, to the point where they cut it in half for the biopsy. So those are kind of the two concerns that are up in the air and at the moment. And then we go into chapter 2, which is called Clover, and that's about Henrietta's early life. And she's living in Clover, Virginia, but her mother does pass away, and so her and her siblings are kind of divvied up between uncles and aunts, and she's actually living with her grandfather. And also living with her is her cousin David, which we also call Day, and they're sharing a room together. They're very young at the time, they're 4, and everyone's kind of working on this tobacco farm. Sorry, I missed my thought. On a tobacco farm, and it's a very labor intensive job for not only them at being such a young age, but also for their community. It's an African American community, very tight knit, very supportive. So at least they have that kind of experience to all share together. But they grow up falling in love later in life, and they have 2 kids together. Really early on, by the time she's 18, she already has 2 kids. And also during this time is a new job opening up at Sparrow Point Mill in Maryland. And so Day goes there because of their cousin Fred, who told them about the position, and they're making better money there. But he still needs to save up in order to bring Henrietta and the kids. So at this time, they're kind of separated in the moment. But it's also World War II, and their cousin Fred ends up getting drafted to the war, and so he gives all his savings to Henrietta. That way, she's able to join him in Maryland after all. So, those are the first 2 chapters. Thank you.
Hi, Rosario. This is my evaluation of your presentation. First off, I would like to say I greatly enjoyed watching your videos. I think you did a great job on a number of levels. And I guess getting into that, I would say that what I found especially enjoyable was how you made me feel, as an audience, feel comfortable. You were very approachable with how you presented yourself, both through gestures, vocal variety, and as well as just where your setting was. I think that you did a good job of putting yourself in a space that really set a scene or a tone nicely for this. Um, although I do think that your presentation could have used a few changes, which would have made it even stronger and more enjoyable to listen to. I would say the first thing that struck me is I questioned the degree of where it fits in with being informal and formal. And I think that in this case, in my opinion, that I think you could have been a little more formal in how you engage the audience. and make it feel a little bit less like a conversation and more like a presentation, um, which could be done either through having a more formal use of your speech that is being written and practiced prior, or just how you choose to disseminate your information. And I think that by being a little more formal, it would help provide a situation in which the information really comes across even stronger than it does. Because although I really enjoyed the comfort and how I felt and was engaged, I feel that it would have been even more enjoyable or beneficial with just having those sort of ideas that I've mentioned worked into it. So I think you have a really strong base and platform, and there isn't a ton that you need to work on as far as engaging an audience um, in an informal setting. And I would love to see what your approach is for a slightly more formal presentation. Anyways, great job, and thanks so much. I hope you've all had a good week since we last met. In this video, I will be expanding upon Rosario's content, which we saw covered chapters 1 through 2, really setting the scene for what I will be covering, respectively, chapters 3 and 4, in the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. At the start of chapter 3, our protagonist learns from John Hopkins that she has tested positive for cervical cancer. We then shift our perspective to the field at large, learning more about her gynecologists Howard Jones and his boss Richard Wesley Talind, who we will see is a central figure in the field. As we learn more about the understanding of cervical cancer and the approaches used in treatment during this time period, we can currently begin to see a picture unfold surrounding the medical malpractice common during that time period of experimenting on patients without their knowledge or consent. For at the time of her procedure, Talind wanted to prove his theory surrounding two types of cervical cancer, demonstrating that they were essentially the same. In doing so, Talind worked with another pivotal figure in this narrative, known as George Gray, the head of tissue culture at Johns Hopkins, who at the time was attempting to grow a line of immortal human cells as a way to understand and treat cancer. The two worked out a deal in which George Gray would be provided a steady stream of cervical cancer tissue in exchange for him attempting to grow these cells. With this background, we are then brought back to Henrietta and the day she returns to Hopkins, essentially keeping the secret of her cancer from her family, telling them only that she needed to return for some medicine. We see her sign a form consenting to any operation deemed necessary by her doctors while under anesthetic. We also then close the chapter with the surgeon taking two samples during her radium treatment without her knowledge, one from healthy cervical tissue and the other from her tumor, which are then delivered to George Gray, ending our chapter. Chapter 4 takes us to the birth of the HeLa cell line. We are introduced to Mary Kubasek, an assistant in George Gray's lab, who is in charge of culturing all tissue samples provided to them. What we see highlighted is the general sense of resignation she has, as their many attempts to culture cells have all ended in failure. At the same time, we begin to learn more about George Gray and his ingenuity and resourcefulness as traits which have been prominent across all facets of his life. We also learn a little bit about his lab partner, Margaret, who seems to really balance and counteract many of the traits of George Gray. Most importantly, helping to provide attempts at proper sterilization within the lab. These efforts are accredited by the author Rebecca Skloot as one of the main contributors to the lab being able to actually culture Henrietta Lacks cells. It is here that we also learn the name HeLa comes from taking the first two letters of the unknowing donor's first and last name. And while all this occurs, we learn that Henrietta appears to be recovering from her radium treatment, ultimately leading to the doctors to discharge her 2 days after insertion, with the instructions to return in 2.5 weeks for a second treatment. The chapter ends with the discovery that the cells from Henrietta's cancerous tissue culture have not only survived but proliferated, growing at rates much higher than any other cells they have attempted to culture prior. It is at this moment where George tells his colleagues that he might have grown the first immortal human cells and agrees to share them, ending chapter 4 and really setting the story on where it will eventually end up where it is today. So their chapters 3 and 4 are very pivotal in understanding where this story is and where it will go.
Okay, this is my my review. Dylan did a great job explaining his two chapters. He was able to include detail without it being overly detailed, and it really just gave a great explanation of those following two chapters, 3 and 4. The only thing I would say was that I would just want a little bit more engagement in the conversation, just a little bit more emotion when he's speaking to all of us. But ultimately, I did really like his presentation. I think it was outlined beautifully, and it was just overall a job well done. Thank you, Dylan.